All right, next, we'll hear from Sean and Jeremy talking about reading the landscape to recognize opportunities. Again, put your questions in the chat and we'll have some time after this next presentation to go through some of those questions. Jeremy, Sean?
Yeah, good morning. This is Sean. Clint, thanks for that. Pretty exciting to see some of that stuff. This idea that you just said, get out and observe. Everybody get out from behind their Zoom machine. And when we're done here and start looking at stuff on the landscape. And that's a nice segue into what we're going to talk about here. This idea about reading the landscape. Next. So this is the guy we've been talking about. He's our mentor, Bill Zeedyk. He came to the Gunnison Basin a number of years ago. And this is a big SGI, Sage Grouse Initiative conference we held there. And one of the things that he likes to start with is this idea about reading the landscape and then thinking like water. Next. You guys see that cabin right there? So that's an old cabin, right? Homestead cabin. You think they built that cabin right in front of a gully? No, they didn't. So one of the ideas that we want to bring out here is a lot of these things on the landscape that we're noticing, these erosive gullies. These are relatively recent events. You know, this is within the last 100 years, we've lost a lot of this stuff across the West. So that's the main thing when you start is trying to understand what's natural and what's not. What was here? What did this look like before? Next. Jeremy introduced this idea of Bill's trilogy. This is how he reads the landscape. He encourages all of us to take into account all of these three disciplines when we're trying to figure out what's going on in a place. And we're going to go through each of these real quick. Next. First, we're going to start with hydrology. One of the more important ones, as Jeremy said, we've recognized this for a long time, that hydrology, geomorphology are major drivers in our wet meadow, mesic meadow systems. But hydrology, the timing, frequency, magnitude, and duration are things that you need to identify first. Next. So the timing, you know, when does the precip arrive? This idea about, you know, when's the water coming? Is it coming all the time? Is it a spring-fed system that's slow and just pretty consistent? Maybe it's a snow melt system, you know, primarily that systems are driven by snow melt coming off the hill. Or maybe some afternoon thunder showers are a primary driver. And you know, these systems aren't all inclusive. They can happen all at the same time, but it's important to try and recognize when water is coming. Next. Also, this idea about, you know, when, how often, what's the frequency that you have water? You know, we talked a little bit about perennial systems. We know that. You guys have been doing BDAs there for a while, that type of stuff. These two next categories are really where we're focusing our work, especially the ephemeral. So streams that run during a certain time of the year, but not all year. These are really important. Jeremy shared that map of all the orders of streams. There's so much out there on the landscape that's ephemeral, and we're trying to highlight that area. Next. How much water? How much water do you have coming? How long does it last? What's a typical magnitude? These are all things to try and understand about a particular area when you're reading the landscape. So what's normal? You see normal in quotes there. Normal storm intensity. Next. This idea about normal. We have a kind of a new normal these days. We can go through a number of severe droughts and then bam, we get a year like this year. You guys have 200% of normal or more snowpack. Lots of flooding going on this year. So this is kind of the new normal. It's feast or famine a little bit. These are things that we want to try and identify and plan for. Next. Geomorphology is a big one. You know, this idea about landform, streams, channels. Jeremy's going to run us through a few ideas on that front. Jeremy?
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. Next slide. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, but what's really fun about this kind of work is hanging out in interdisciplinary groups, learning from others. And I picked up a few tips from Joe Wheaton and geomorphologists. And this has been a game changer in how I think when I go walk in these valleys, right? So what we're giving you are some things that go through our heads as we're walking around. And in addition to hydrology, there's some key features in the landforms out there that you should learn to recognize. And a really big one is if you're standing in that valley or the bottom area of a landscape, you're going to notice things like channels or a single channel, floodplains, those areas adjacent to the channel, both active ones that get water regularly during floods and those that are inactive, like depicted here. Sometimes those are down cut or incised such that they look like maybe they were once a floodplain, but they're no longer able to get up and out of that channel now. Of course, then we have things like terraces, which are historic floodplains, things that developed under different flow regimes and aren't part of the current restoration opportunity. Other features like alluvial fans, where you get another tributary coming into a main stem area, you get deposits that form, and that's a fan and something to recognize when you're out there on the landscape. And then this term valley bottom, and if we just go to the next slide, this is one we'll use a lot. Again, when we walk down through these systems, we've been so trained to think about streams as channels that we immediately try to find the channel, and then we look to manage right along adjacent to it, right? We create riparian buffers, we do fencing, we manage all of that, but we fail to recognize that maybe that system, maybe it never even had a channel historically. Maybe it was just grass and extended all the way out to the hill slopes. And so we want you to be able to recognize as we get out there on the ground what a valley bottom is. And the valley bottom is really the channel or channels, if they exist, and the floodplain. And that will be something we'll want to look to identify, not just with vegetation, because sometimes that vegetation is only indicative of the hydrology that's occurring. That system could be impaired. But that valley bottom is the maximum potential riparian area. So if you are to restore this, that would be the area that you'd have enough subsurface water to have riparian vegetation. Next slide. Channel incision is a widespread problem that we'll be talking about here, mostly addressing during this workshop. This is a great figure from the BLM's proper functioning condition manual. Just kind of shows the role of the water table below ground. So when you're walking around out there and you see like wetland or mesic meadow vegetation, it's usually because that water table is really high, subsurface water table is high. But as we start to get channels forming and then down cutting through those soils for whatever reason, you see weird things like sagebrush starting to creep into like Baltic rush areas, right? It's this unholy marriage of upland and wetland plants. And then finally, as it progresses too far, you lose all of those wetland and mesic obligate species, and you end up with upland and dry meadow vegetation and sagebrush. As that water table drops, green groceries go away. Next slide. You may hear this term thrown around now. In the last decade, there's been this evolution in our thinking about how streams work and how this incision process plays out. For years, we've recognized this predictable progression as streams downcut. Some of you may be familiar with Shum's channel evolution model. Well, the latest iteration of that is something called a stream evolution model by Kluwer and Thorne that brought back this idea that perhaps there was a stage 0 condition, something before a channel ever formed. And those are starting to be features that we recognize as being much more prevalent than we had previously acknowledged. These are happening in our depositional reaches within a watershed where you come out of a canyon and you drop some gradient and you widen out. Those are places where we likely had more of a meadow. Maybe we had no channel at all, or we had several channels and it was always floodplain connected. And so this stage 0 condition is something that is really representative of the meadows that we're talking about restoring here today. Next, I'll turn this back over to Sean, I think, here to talk a little bit about the specifics of head cuts in the channel incision process.
Yeah, thanks. Super important, the channel incision process. Remember that as we go through this presentation. The green groceries go away because the water table is dropping out of these systems. So we wanted to talk about head cut real quick. Some people call them nick points. It's this abrupt change in elevation. On the left side there, you can see it's probably a 2-foot head cut. This is really the leading edge of gully erosion. This head cut is migrating up valley. And below that, the gully forms, all the water becomes concentrated below a head cut like this as it starts to get into this channel first on the right here. It's disconnected. You can see it's disconnected from the floodplain again. And it's down cut. Next. And this idea about how do head cuts advance is super important because that leads us into process-based restoration. But the top picture there, you can see all the little rootlets hanging down. It's really the plants. They die. When they're dried out, they die and they're no longer able to hold the soil. And when the first storm comes, all that soil is then washed away and rinse and repeat. This happens over and over and over again. And the head cut just keeps moving up valley. Next. I wanted to show this slide just to understand. You can see the sponge now. You can see the water oozing out of that head cut. There's no surface water currently coming down this meadow, but there's a lot of water stored in the soil and it's all coming out of this particular head cut. Next. I'm kind of obsessed with head cut pictures, but yes, there's a few examples here, and they come in many forms. Some are uglier than others, of course, but they all do the same thing. They create a channel below them and they move up valley if no intervention is happening. Next. And again, really important, this idea about stage 0 potentially in these wet and mesic meadows area. They really shouldn't have a channel. Historically, surface flow just flowed as sheet flow across this entire meadow and didn't have a channel to concentrate the flow. Next. This is an important concept too to understand, flowing waters that spread out at the top of this figure on the left, a traditional wet or mesic meadow, water is going across the entire surface. It's shallow, it moves slower, has time to soak into the ground, doesn't have a lot of power, but as soon as it goes through that head cut and becomes concentrated in the gully, it's many times the erosive force now, all of that water gathered together, and it moves really fast and it rushes off the landscape. And as we learned before, after this channel incision process, you can see the water table drops out of it and the plants dry out then on each side. Next. Just a quick example, you can see this big meadow in Wyoming. Next. It's got sheet flow all across the top of it, water spread out across the entire surface. It hits this one head cut, and then it makes a channel and it starts to rush off the landscape. Next. Same situation, same spot. You can see sheet flow flat, no channel above this point. Then there's this nasty head cut here. All the water drops into this gully and rushes off the landscape. And so these are the things we're trying to counteract. We really like the sheet flow idea. especially in these meadows where we're storing water, water's going slowly and infiltrating instead of rushing off the landscape in concentrated flow. Next. So how do these things happen? Definitely concentrated flow, it gets trapped in roads and trails all across the West. If you were running your wagon up the valley bottom, you weren't running it on the side hill through all the rocks. You ran it right up the bottom of the valley, and maybe you left some ruts. We're doing the same thing today. The water gets in those channels and starts to run faster, creates a gully, and then we get our channel incision process. Next. So it's not just the wagons, right? It's all of us still going up the valley bottom. This is a BLM road in Gunnison. It's open to the public, and you can tell all the water that comes off this hillside on either side gets in those ruts. Instead of getting into the meadow and infiltrating as sheep flow, it gets into these ruts, creates more erosion, and these ruts eventually turn into gullies and dewater the system. Next. So here's a creek, sort of a creek. It's this big gully here. And we talked about the valley bottom. And so when you're reading the landscape, sometimes you want to know, is this really a creek, or is this where the water should be? It kind of looks like it's on the side hill a little bit. Next. Right over here on the right side where that blue dot is, that's the true valley bottom. That's where the bottom of the valley really is, which makes this creek, up on the side hill. And before I met Bill, I would just think, yeah, that's where the creek is. It just turned into a gully. But he taught us to recognize this is actually an old road, and it's trapping all the water coming down the valley. And so the water isn't actually able to get to the true valley bottom where all the potential really exists. Next. Similar example, although this is like a cattle trail or some kind of trail. You can kind of tell it's not in the true valley bottom. Next. Over here is where the true valley bottom is, right? That's where all your potential is. That's where your deeper soils are. It's where your mesic vegetation already is. All the water is being trapped in this cattle trail up on the side hill and not able to access that area. So reading the landscapes, really, it leads us into this idea about, is this really a channel? Should a channel be here? Where should the water really be? Next. So this idea about recognizing road effects. As you look at this picture, we're looking up valley, and you can see the new road there on the right top corner. That's where people currently drive. And then the arrow is pointing to a gully. That's the old road that we used to use until it got too bad. We couldn't drive it. So what do? We just move uphill a little bit, make a new road. But all the water coming down this valley bottom is stuck in that gully. And if you look at this drying meadow on the left side, all of that sagebrush within the circle has invaded a former wet meadow area before the road stole all of the water. So understanding that this road is having an effect, and understanding what the landscape may have used to look like really tells us that this area where the circle is has the highest potential for restoration. It has all the deep soils still. It just needs to have the water put back onto it. Next. So we're still talking about reading the landscape and geomorphology. Soils and sediment is a big part of what we look at. For example, on the left side, you've seen this picture, all that deep black soil is a big sponge. And so when we have that type of situation, we have that sponge, that leads us to think we really have some good opportunities here. And so what is you can tell on the right side here, the particle size, this stream here, an ephemeral stream, is rolling, some gravel size stuff. So there's quite a bit of power coming down this particular spot. So that can tell you a lot about examining that kind of stuff. Next. There may be some wetland delineators in the field out here in the audience. These red streaks, oxidized rhizospheres, tell you in this soil profile here that this area used to be a lot wetter, right? Those things form under saturated conditions. And if you look at the vegetation now, it's a bunch of upland looking grasses. It's not really wet or mesic, but the soil tells you that this place used to be wet. So that can tell you a lot. So what are the soils telling you? Next. Where's the sediment coming from? This thing is an alluvial fan in this picture, all that sediment right there. It's a big fan coming down from the left. Maybe that's a good sediment source. We could use that sediment to try and rebuild this incising creek here. Next. Particle size, is it silt, sand, gravel? What's the size? You can see on the left as sagebrush fell in the creek. Look at the sediment flow that it trapped in behind. That's just some really fine clay, hard to trap that stuff. Or on the right, sandy soils, Northwest Colorado, super erosive, stuff's going really fast right there. So soils, sediment, particle size, all of that stuff is good to take into account when you're trying to understand what's going on in a particular reach. Next. Finally, let's end up with ecology here. This is the last part of our trilogy. So talking about what kinds of animals use the area. Next. This idea about animal interactions. Some of the stuff you need to understand about a place, are you working in a grazed pasture? When do they graze it? How often do they graze it? Again, animals too, we've got the elk coming through, wild horses, how are they using it? Is there evidence of trailing, old evidence of beaver? All of this stuff is important to take into account when you're trying to understand a particular area. Next. Vegetation is a really big one for me. It's a great storyteller. This idea that if you know your plants in a particular area, they can actually tell you how much water is there typically. So a gradation between, water-loving plants all the way up to your upland plants. And so if you have folks that you can go out with or your plants in a particular area, they can tell you a whole lot about what's going on underground, how much water there is, and what you might expect. Next. So looking at historical plant activity too, and like Clit said, be observant when you go out, note these changes. What's going on in this meadow? Is this sagebrush invading this meadow? It kind of looks like it's starting like a bunch of new plants coming in into this meadow. We see this pretty often when meadows start to dry out, the sagebrush starts to encroach and infill into our meadow areas. Next. The picture on the left, we've got some ancient Bebb's willows. Maybe they tell you where the water is. Maybe there's a spring there. Conversely, there's a bunch of dead willows on the right-hand side. All that ancient dead wood there is all old willows with some currant, some kind of ribes growing up in between there. But that might tell you, hey, this used to be a lot wetter right here. Used to grow these big willows. And that tells you maybe there's some site potential there still. Maybe this is a place to try and re-wet or make better potentially because it still has a site potential in the soil. Next. So water is flowing down this swale away from us. We've got some potentilla in the foreground, some sedge maybe it's a rush in the foreground. And then all of a sudden the vegetation at the end here is telling you something's going on. It looks like a juniper is there, a bunch of tall sage. And yeah, if you were to walk down there, there's a head cut at the bottom of this meadow, and it enters a gully. All the water goes into the head cut, gets into a gully. All the water table drops out of this system, and we lose our wet meadow. So vegetation can be a great storyteller, telling you what's going on. Next. Here's a tricky one. What's the vegetation telling you here? We got a bunch of sagebrush. Looks like a bunch of dead sagebrush in this meadow. And in my line of work, we kind of love this, actually. We don't mind this at all. We feel like we have a lot of sagebrush on the landscape and not very much wet meadow. And so we treated this area. We put water back onto this meadow. And within 48 hours, the sagebrush starts to turn white and look pretty sorry because its feet are wet. And not too long after that, it dies. And so this is actual restoration happening. We are reclaiming this wet area, formerly wet area. And so the vegetation is telling you that. Next. So again, with the animals and community interactions, trailing is a big one in our systems. As Jim mentioned, it's not just cows, it's all kinds of livestock, elk, really good at this, wild horses, particularly destructive in some areas. And this trailing up and down the valley bottom in riparian areas can be detrimental because the water gets in these trails, especially if they're running straight down the valley bottom like this, and it just makes a channel. That's the new channel. So trailing is something that we see a lot. It's something to recognize and understand if it's a problem or not. You know, we don't care so much. Our animals trail all the time in the upland. We just would prefer they didn't trail up and down the valley bottom to create a channel that would steal the water. Next. So this picture, water's coming towards us. You can see in the background there, really nice green, wet meadow. All the water comes into this cattle trail on the left here, and it's down cut. You can't tell how incised it is here. It's about 1.5 feet. But you can see all the sagebrush moving into this meadow at the bottom. And this is because of the dewatering effect of this trail. It steals all the water and takes it away. Next. Similar idea, water's coming again. This is a little more advanced condition. The gully has really formed and now the sagebrush is really choking this former meadow. But this tells you that by reading the landscape, if you understand that this process, this channel incision process is happening, it can be really good to show you, hey, if we put water back onto this surface, we can reclaim this meadow and not let the sagebrush take it over again. Next. So this idea that Bill pushes, reading the landscape, that's his first step, really, that we should all try and endeavor to understand. And really, we're really talking about process-based restoration here today. So understanding, those processes that make for or contribute to healthy systems, wet and mesic meadows, is really important. This idea about sheet flow, water in the soil, and vegetation being a key component. So learning to recognize these impairments is really important. What's natural, what isn't, and reading the landscapes helps us do that. Great.
So we have time for some Q&A on the material we've covered so far. If Eric wants to come on in.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the questions have already been answered in the Q&A. So I think one of the questions that come out that had been asked is, in one of Clint's photos, there was both some Zeedyk and some BDA, and when you would use both of those. I think some of that will be answered in the future, but does one of you Sean or Clint want to jump on that one?
All her, that was my slide. So I just, the point of that slide, and I really didn't emphasize it just due to time, but is sometimes I find biologists or restoration practitioners will say they think they need all this recipe, step 1, step 2, step 3. And we got into this, we're all creative. We've got a lot of things going on in our head. Get out there, have fun, look at a site, combine techniques, be willing to experiment. I'm not going to say when one of those works, when the other doesn't work, or when you should combine stick, wood, rock. Just enjoy it, have fun, be creative, be willing to try something different. That's those photos were from one of my colleagues in Colorado, and I really like that. He's combined some techniques and he's out there being creative and having fun.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Clint.
Eric, I'll just dogpile on that and say, you know, when I got asked to help our agency scale up some of this low tech work, you know, 8 years ago or so, I couldn't tell you the answer to that. It was a mystery. The whole point of this workshop is to get you to see the processes that we're trying to heal. And once you understand that, you know how Sean was talking about the rinse and repeat of the roots. Once you understand what you're trying to do there, you can get much more creative about the techniques. Now, what we're sharing with you are techniques that people have tried and they've honed in and they seem to work, but you're going to vary that based on the local materials you have access to and, you know, kind of your creativity. So hopefully by the end of the day, you'll be able to see those key things that need to be addressed and then open your mind up about how we can address them.
Thanks, Jeremy. So one of the other questions, real quick, and then we'll probably move on just to keep us as close to schedule as we can. Some of these, most of these have been answered in the Q&A, but Rose Smith had said, I'm noticing a trend in field sites I visited in northern Utah of a big dry trench downstream from stock ponds held by earthen dams. Can folks speak to the process happening here and the best way to address erosion downstream of these ponds? John or Jeremy, do you want to take a stab? I think referring to the runoff that comes behind those dams is often causing an additional gully. Any thoughts?
You know, I'm not sure without seeing it. I have noticed some of that, and I wasn't sure if you know, those gullies existed prior to, you know, maybe the dams being installed. I've seen a lot of that too. I don't know. Not sure how to answer that without seeing it. If it is a pretty widespread problem there below stock tanks, is it
Yeah, we have, I've seen this particularly, you know, Sean, when we went up to Montana and like the plains states where they don't get a lot of snowpack and they built a dugout in every single drainage. What you're doing is messing up the hydrology for that whole watershed, right? So when you drain, basically take that moisture out of the system that used to feed meadows and meadow vegetation, riparian vegetation, which is much more robust than upland vegetation, you shift that to an upland plant situation that is more vulnerable to being eroded. So when you do get runoff events, it falls apart. You know, if you have it covered in Nebraska sedge, that thing is like concrete during runoff. If it's in Kentucky bluegrass, it gets blown out. So that's kind of my hypothesis on what might be going on there.
Yeah, I'd kind of add to that too, Jeremy, that you'd have to look at you have to back out a little bit. You have to kind of step away from it from a distance and see what the other stressors that might be on making that trench. If it's, is it stuff going around the dam that's making the water come out? Is it going over the top? What are you protecting above and below that trench? Or what, you know, what does it look like? What's the vegetation telling you around that degraded area? And that'll kind of give you a hint on what needs to be done.
Okay, another quick question. What success level do these types of structures have on steeper sloped waterways? Mark works for the Forest Service, so he's thinking further upstream in some of these narrower valleys and steeper slopes. What kind of success do you have there? Sean,
Yeah,
you
I
wanna-
think, definitely the steeper you get, the harder it is to slow water down and spread it out, of course. In valley type, we didn't talk too much about that, but valley type makes a big influence too. Are you in a V-shaped valley or is it kind of spread out? One thing you can do is install more structures, particularly grade control structures. Maybe it's more needed on a steeper area, or maybe you're trying to capitalize on, short flat sections between steep sections. But I think it can work in all types of situations, these types of structures. It's just maybe your extent of effectiveness is limited when it gets really steep.
Yeah, I kind of added to that comment in the chat, in the Q&A, saying that, not all erosion is bad either. You could be utilizing some of that material coming from the sides of those steep cut banks and then filling with it lower down to make it flatter and to kind of level off that gradient. So not all erosion is bad.
How dare you say that, Jim? You work for the NRCS, the former Soil Conservation Service. Yeah, it's almost heresy. I run around the West saying the same thing, but my saying is you can't build floodplains without erosion and deposition. So learning to recognize those landforms, like I showed that, when you see raw soil, don't just go, we got to cover it with something. In a valley bottom, erosion is part of the natural processes that build floodplains. And so you got to understand a bit about, well, what kind of a surface is being eroded? Where's that soil going if it does erode, and it perhaps go into a depositional reach like a meadow, right? That where the gradient does slow down and spread out. Yeah, great point.
Okay, we've got time for maybe just a couple of more quick questions. One of the questions comes in. I learned about log step fall head cut treatments recently. Do you have any experience with those? I imagine that they might. They might be difficult to utilize in sagebrush areas with no trees or large CWD nearby.
Yes, we do have experience with those, and I think we'll be covering some of that when we get to talking about specific structures. And so maybe I can hit on that question specifically with regards to, acquiring wood or how you do that. They are a nice, effective head cut control technique, the log and step falls, especially when you don't have rock or you want to try something that's a little bit bigger that you want to build by hand. So maybe we'll table that one a little bit and we'll come back to it, Eric.
Yeah, I think there's.
I'll just say we've done a few too down in southern Utah, so they are being utilized.
Yeah, I think there's a few of these questions we can kind of punt to later in the day. There's another one about recognizing the difference between, sheet flow, and how to recognize those. I think that'll be covered a little bit later. If not, we can bring it up a little bit later. One of the questions that just popped up was, what are the most common things that create and start head cuts? I know we've kind of thrown head cuts around a lot, so maybe if one of you could take just a second and talk about, maybe some things that could cause head cuts. Are they all human induced, or can some of these occur, quote unquote, naturally? Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, head cuts do occur naturally, and it is something to think about, and Joe Wheaton always likes to remind us that, hey, all head cuts aren't bad, and especially in stream systems, we're reorganizing stuff all the time, and so we shouldn't always just think that head cuts are a bad thing. But because we're specifically talking about wet and mesic wet meadows, this head cuts are a problem. So they are taking our wet meadows and downgrading them across the West. And so they are in an unnatural situation there. Now what causes them? Gosh, there's so many different drivers there. You know, a big one is the whole system is going down. So for example, the main stem river at the bottom is decreasing in elevation, and everything above that is trying to come to that new equilibrium. And so some of that stuff is natural across the landscape. We were just talking this morning about head cuts, small little tiny head cuts that this year have really expanded with a massive amount of runoff, and just so much runoff this year, maybe under an ice dam. Jim, you were talking about this, that has really affected some stuff. Jeremy, do you have anything to add on head cuts?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to what you said, you know, just those disturbances to that vegetation, like Sean mentioned, the plant roots that hold fine clay particle soils together in these meadows, you know, that can happen with livestock, an elk wallow, or, you know, any type of thing like that can be a nick point. And those little ponds sometimes become prevalent throughout the meadow, and eventually one pond turns into another pond, turns into a channel over time. And so we've seen that happen. And yeah, like there are some things we can control, and other things like the entire watershed adjusting to a new base elevation that we can either let it run its course, and in 5 centuries, maybe it'll be back to something beneficial, or we can intervene and try to preserve stuff that we value.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And Sean, I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of these things are just natural processes that we're now using to kind of manipulate a landscape for our own benefit, whether it's wildlife or whether it's livestock, or, you know, maybe we're trying to protect road structures that are in the path of some of these erosion events. So it seems like a lot of the things we do, it's kind of tied up in trying to use or manage these natural processes. So there's some other questions. Natalie Windward had asked about opportunities to get in the field. There will be some opportunities coming up, so watch for that. It's kind of limited this first go around, but we hope to be increasing that. We'll answer the rest of your questions in the document that'll go out. We're up against the break here, so we want to give everybody a chance to take a break, and we'll come back in about 10 or 15 minutes. So plan on being back here in 15 minutes for our next presentation.
And everybody watch this time lapse. It's pretty cool if you're not leaving your desk.